The afternoon sun was beginning to tilt towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the shattered remains of a city that no longer appeared on any official map. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, in a landscape reduced to mud and twisted metal, a unit of Navy SEALs was pinned down. They were part of a joint tactical operation, but at this moment, their advanced training, their years of experience, and their legendary status meant nothing. They were prey. The operation had started in the cold and pre-dawn darkness. Insertion by helicopter was deemed too risky due to the concentration of Russian anti-aircraft systems, so the team had humped in on foot, moving through tree lines and dry creek beds for 6 hours. Their objective was an enemy command and control node located in the basement of a bombed-out vocational school. Intelligence suggested it was lightly guarded, a soft target ripe for capture or elimination. But intelligence, as it often does in war, lied. And as the 8-man SEAL team moved into the final approach, the world exploded. It wasn't just small arms fire, it was a perfectly executed ambush. Heavy machine guns from reinforced positions chewed through the brick walls they were using for cover. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked across the open ground, and the distinctive bone-shaking crump of mortar rounds began walking its way toward their position. "Contact front! Contact right!" The shouts were primal, ripped from throats raw with adrenaline. The SEALs, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tex Williams and his team, fought back with everything they had. Their return fire was precise, disciplined, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They had walked into a kill box. The enemy had clearly been waiting for them. "Tex, we gotta move! They're bracketing us!" a voice screamed over the deafening roar. Tex scanned desperately for an exit. The building behind them was crumbling. Yet the street in front was a shooting gallery. The only possible cover was a bomb crater 50 meters away, but the ground between was a flat expanse of pavement being systematically chewed apart by machine gun fire. It was certain death. He pulled the last fragmentation grenade from his vest, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. They would sell their lives dearly, but they would sell them here, in this godforsaken street. "No way out! We're trapped!" another SEAL yelled, and his voice tight with the terror of a cornered animal. They were the apex predators of the modern battlefield, yet here they were, huddled behind inadequate cover, waiting for the final push that would wipe them out. The enemy gunners, sensing blood, increased their rate of fire, the bullets impacting the wall above their heads with the sound of 1,000 jackhammers. Tex looked at his men, seeing the acceptance in their eyes. They were soldiers, and they understood the mathematics of war. And this equation was simple, them versus 100, with no variable for escape. But there was a variable they hadn't accounted for. 700 meters away, perched in the skeletal remains of a high-rise apartment building, a figure lay motionless in the shadows. The nest was a masterclass in concealment. The shooter was buried under a layer of debris, crumbled concrete, twisted rebar, and a specially designed mat that scattered the shooter's heat signature, and making them invisible to thermal drones. This was Olena, a woman the locals had begun to whisper about. To the Ukrainian forces, she was known simply by her call sign, Vidma, the witch. Not for any supernatural power, but for her seemingly unnatural ability to appear from nowhere and exact a terrible price on those who hunted her people. At 54 years old, Olena was a grandmother, a widow, and one of the most dangerous people on the battlefield. She was also technically blind in one eye, so her left optic nerve had been destroyed 2 years prior by the concussive force of a tank barrage that had nearly killed her near Bakhmut. She had counted 36 direct hits on her bunker before the Russian tank finally ran out of ammunition. The blasts had stolen her stereoscopic vision, the depth perception considered essential for a sniper. Doctors told her she would never shoot accurately again. They didn't understand Olena, and she had learned to shoot at the age of 4 on her family's farm. Her husband, a reconnaissance officer who had died of COVID just before the full-scale invasion, had begged her to stay safe, to take a cook's position rather than a combat role. She had complied then, but after he was gone and the Russians came, there was no one left to ask her to be safe. She had retrained her brain to judge distance using shadows, perspective, and the subtle shifts in color. She now shot better than most soldiers with two good eyes. Her weapon of choice was an UAR-10, a semi-automatic sniper rifle that fired a 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO round. It was heavy, nearly 10 kilograms, but to her it felt like an extension of her own body. Through her scope, she saw the entire tragedy unfolding. She saw the American team, their uniforms unmistakable even under a layer of grime, pinned against the wall. She saw the muzzle flashes from the enemy strongpoint, at a fortified position in a ground-floor apartment about 600 meters out. The geometry was difficult. The angle was oblique, and the target was partially obscured by a burned-out truck. A regular sniper might wait for a better shot. A regular sniper might radio for coordinates and call in artillery. But Olena knew that by the time artillery arrived, the Americans would be overrun. She keyed her radio, her voice a low, calm whisper. "Sunray, this is Vidma. I have eyes on the friendly unit. They are compromised. Request permission to engage and suppress." The reply was immediate and tense. "Vidma, negative. Hold position. We are scrambling close air support. ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes. She looked back through the scope. The Americans didn't have 7 minutes. She saw the enemy infantry beginning to shift, preparing for the final assault. The variable she had noticed, the one the SEALs on the ground couldn't see, was the machine gunner. He was the linchpin. If he could be taken out, the assault would falter, if only for a few critical seconds. She made her decision. Disobeying a direct order was a court-martial offense, but watching men die when she could act was a sin she couldn't commit. She adjusted her aim, accounting for the tricky wind currents swirling between the buildings. She breathed in, the air tasting of dust and cordite. She breathed out, letting half the air leave her lungs, and the crosshairs settled on a sliver of space between the concrete barrier and the truck's hood, a space just wide enough for a bullet. The machine gunner was spraying suppressive fire, his body rocking with the recoil. He was confident, arrogant in his safety. Olena's finger applied steady, increasing pressure on the trigger. The shot surprised her. It wasn't a loud crack, but more of a sharp, precise snap that was instantly swallowed by the chaos of the battlefield. 600 meters away, the enemy machine gun fell silent. The gunner crumpled backward without a sound, a perfect center mass hit. On the ground, Tex heard the change before he understood it. The relentless stream of lead chewing up the street stopped. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise. "Cease fire! Cease fire! What the hell?" he yelled. He risked a glance over the wall. The machine gun nest was still there, but the gun was pointed skyward. The gunner slumped over it. And then he heard it, the distinct echoing crack of a high-powered sniper rifle from somewhere deep in the city behind him. They had a guardian angel. Olena didn't pause to admire her work. She cycled the bolt, the spent casing ejecting with a soft clink. She shifted her aim. The second target was an RPG gunner preparing to fire on the SEAL's position. She fired again. The man dropped, the rocket launcher clattering harmlessly onto the concrete. A third shot, a fourth. At each round was a surgical strike, dismantling the enemy's firepower with cold, mechanical precision. She was a ghost in the machine, unseen and unstoppable. The enemy commander on the ground realized his ambush had a fatal flaw. They had planned for the Americans. They had not planned for the angel of death in the tower. Panic set in. The assault stalled. Soldiers broke cover, trying to flee back into the relative safety of their buildings. This was the moment. "Now! Go, go, go!" Tex screamed. The SEALs didn't hesitate. They exploded from their cover, bounding towards the crater. They moved in perfect, fluid motion, covering each other, their rifles up and hunting. Tex, as he ran, glanced back towards the city. He still couldn't see the shooter, but he knew exactly where she was. He saw a brief, almost imperceptible glint of light, the sun reflecting off a scope lens as the shooter adjusted position. It was a flash of salvation. With the enemy in disarray, and the SEALs reached the crater and established a hasty defense. The immediate threat was over. They were bruised, bloody, and shaken, but alive. Tex looked at his team, counting heads. 8 men went in, 8 men came out. Hours later, after the situation was stabilized and a quick reaction force had extracted them, Tex found himself back at the forward operating base. He sat on an ammo crate, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, still processing the afternoon. And the door to the command tent opened, and a figure walked in. It was small, wearing a mismatched uniform, with a weather-beaten face and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. A woman, old enough to be his mother. She moved with a quiet grace, favoring one leg slightly, a remnant of old wounds. Their eyes met. There was no need for dramatic introductions. He knew. The woman gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of thanks or a request for praise. It was a nod of professional acknowledgement. Job done. Tex stood up, walking over to her. The tent was noisy with radio chatter and planning, but for them, it was quiet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I don't know how to thank you. We had no way out. We were done. And then—" He trailed off, gesturing helplessly. Olena looked at him, her gaze steady. She didn't see a Navy SEAL, a warrior from an elite force. She saw a young man, probably with a family somewhere, who had almost died today. "It was just shooting," she said simply, her accent heavy. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the hum of the generators outside. "You do your job. I do mine." Tex shook his head. "That wasn't just shooting. That was... I've never seen anything like it. The angle, the distance, the timing. You saved my life. You saved all our lives." Olena was quiet for a moment, thinking of her husband who had tried to protect her from this life. Of the 10-year-old son she rarely saw, of the brothers she no longer spoke to who had fled the country while she chose to fight. She thought of the tank that had tried to kill her, of the 36 shots that had stolen her depth perception but sharpened her resolve. She thought of the faces of the men she had shot today, men who, in another life, might have been farmers or factory workers. She felt no joy in it, only a grim, necessary satisfaction. "Your screams," she finally said, looking directly into his eyes. "When you were pinned, I heard your screams on the radio net. No way out. I heard them." She took a slow breath, her gaze drifting for a second towards the canvas wall of the tent, as if she could see through it to the battlefields she had crossed. "I know what it is to have a tank hunting you. To know there is no way out," she continued, her voice even quieter now. "To count the hits and wait for the one that will end you. When I heard you, I wasn't just seeing soldiers in trouble. I was seeing myself 2 years ago, in that bunker near Bakhmut." She looked back at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than stone-cold duty crossed her face. "I couldn't save myself that day. The damage was already done inside my head," she said, touching her temple lightly. "But I could save you. So it was never just shooting. It was necessary." She turned to leave, her work here done, and the men she had saved would write their reports, get their debriefs, and eventually go home. She would go back to her unit, clean her rifle, and wait for the next mission, the next call in the dark. Before she pushed through the tent flap, she paused and looked back at Tex. "You tell your men," she said, her voice regaining its firmness. that as long as there is one of us left who can hold a rifle, there is always a way out. Tell them the witch is watching." Then she was gone, disappearing into the night as silently as she had appeared on the battlefield, a living legend forged not in the halls of power, but in the mud and fire of a war she never asked for, but refused to lose.